Hello, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar with Mono Solutions. The Buy It Yourself future is here. My name is Lizzie, and I am the Senior Account Manager for Locology, and I will be your host for today's event. A few housekeeping items before we begin. This webinar is being recorded and will be circulated to all attendees with the presentation within 24 hours of the broadcast. Questions will be answered during the Q&A session at the end. You can, however, ask questions at any time during the broadcast by using the question window in your control panel. Our speaker today is Matt Matargia. Matt heads up business development for Mono Solutions in the Americas. With nearly a decade of experience in the local and digital media industry, Matt focuses on helping their partners find success in the marketplace from a holistic vantage point. Matt has years of hands-on experience with the challenges companies face when selling digital services and technology to SMBs, from working with some of the biggest names in local and digital media like Bex Media and Location 3 Media. We are also joined by Charles Laughlin, who is a senior analyst with Locology. Without further ado, I will hand things over to Charles and Matt to get started.
Thanks, Lizzie.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Lizzie. So this is Charles Laughlin talking. Welcome. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today. Hello, Matt. How's it going today?
Hey, Charles. All good on my end. Happy to be here.
Great, great. So why don't we get into it? What we're going to start with is kind of a little bit of context for this conversation we're having today. We recently, Locology working with Mono Solutions, issued a report that we call Is the BIY or Buy It Yourself Future Here? And it's available to download if you just visit the locology.com website. You can find it there. We'll have more information on that later. But we wanted to sort of answer some fundamental questions of, is buy it yourself, which we'll define in a second. But is it happening now, or what's the future look like for it? How what is SMBs' likelihood to adopt BIY, and what are the pros and cons of following this path? We'll get into a lot more throughout the rest of this webinar on sort of what BIY is all about, but that's just reference point that there's a white paper that has a lot of data and insights and commentary on this topic as well, and we encourage you to go check it out. So as far as today's webinar goes, we have a handful of objectives that we want to achieve before the end of this. One is just to make sure that we're all on the same page on what exactly BIY means, buy it yourself. What does it mean? We'll offer a definition. Love to hear your feedback on your own take on it during Q&A or perhaps afterwards. You can reach out to us. And we're going to review sort of how we got here, and sort of what are the sort of events that have led up to what we describe as a BIY future, but it's also a BIY present, which we'll get into as well. We're going to talk a little bit, we're going to show you a lot of data from a survey that we did. One of the things that really jumped out from the survey was the generational component of the adoption of buy it yourself by small business. And then really, when people talk about BIY, the immediate thought is, oh, robots replacing salespeople. And what we're going to argue here is that that's not really what we're talking about at all. What we're talking about is an evolution of sales, and there's going to be sort of a new take on the long-term role of salespeople in this space, and BIY certainly impacts that, but we're not arguing for or predicting the demise of live salespeople. We're also going to share some commentary that we gathered from others in the industry who are living this every day, and then share a vision for how those selling to SMBs need to think about BIY and how it fits into what they're doing. So what we're going to do is, right now is for the purpose of the survey we did, which was like the meat of the white paper, and we'll share bits of it here as well. We wanted to give a definition that the survey respondents could review and then understand what we're asking them. So I'm not going to read it verbatim here, but essentially it's an intelligent platform that guides a buyer through the purchase journey up until the point of sale and completion of the transaction. So it's everything sort of leading up to through the purchase decision, qualification, needs analysis, all of that, and then offering a relevant program depending on what the product is through to completing the sale, really before the human interaction takes place. It could be like in some environments it's zero interaction, and what we'll get into here is a lot more conversation about where sort of sales and service picks up after the customer acquisition. But this is sort of how we define it for this purpose. And somebody named Matt Maturgia had a pretty important comment in the paper that we think kind of summarizes a lot of what we're going to be talking about here. The idea that, you know, the power, what used to be sort of the purview of enterprise is now sort of pushed down into the SMB market. That's sort of one thing that's really changed a lot in the last several years. And this notion that I think that also kind of touches on how consumer behavior is influencing the conversation we're going to have here is this notion of the power shifting from the seller to the buyer. And that's all about sort of the self-education that goes on in the buying process leading up to well before any interaction with a salesperson. And that really sort of is a big overhanging theme on this whole conversation. So.
Yeah, and I was happy not to quote myself, Charles.
Yeah, that's always a little weird. So thanks for letting me do that one. So why don't you take it from here, Matt?
But yeah, no, I mean, that is underlying all this is obviously that power is shifting from the buyer to seller. And we did a previous report with yourself and Locology, and you and I have presented this before, but we looked at sort of go-to-market and fulfillment for digital services. And one of the conclusions that we had was, today's SMB buyer is three things: impatient, intelligent, and independent. And what does that mean? Basically, as you kind of alluded to, they're doing self-research and they're also willing to self-service. So when we were looking to engage on this paper with you guys in this survey, I think it was really the obvious next step to also look at how do small businesses want to buy, and is there a role if we know small businesses want to perhaps do it themselves and have more control and transparency into what they're doing with software and digital marketing, do they also want to buy themselves? So a little bit of kind of our thought around this this process is that yes, the SMBs are no different than consumers. They do want to self-procure, and I think there's kind of two forces that are conditioning that behavior. Number one is definitely I want it now, I want it when I want, and I want to probably try it before I buy it too. So there's kind of this on-demand economy, the Uberification, the Amazonification of things. We're getting used to getting everything we want when we want, certainly not talking to salespeople. And then, of course, the other end of the coin is there's just this complete abundance of information that's available online and for free, that as consumers and as buyers, we can go and educate ourselves. And I think that's only been even exacerbated by, account-based marketing and inbound sales, where companies are putting out more information and they're not making salespeople the gatekeeper. So that was sort of the thought behind this. I think that consumer expectations are and will continue to shape not just sales, but service and fulfillment going forward too. And speaking on fulfillment and sort of go to market, we did want to make one distinction, and we wrote this in the report too, but that distinction is, it's kind of easy to interchange do it yourself and buy it yourself, but they're not synonymous. So we see, do it yourself, while that has kind of a component, of course, of buy it yourself, you can also self-serve and self-buy, do it for me services, and really, the full circle would be even sales assisted and what we've called do it with me in the past. And we'll kind of get into how fulfillment and go to market plays really nicely with this process of buying yourself. So Charles, I think you're best to talk a little bit about the methodology.
Yeah. So we, of course, going back to doing the white paper, we fielded a survey, through a research partner, where we basically wanted to ask companies that sell media and technology to small business, how they view BIY, whether they're using it or any sort of precursor to it through some various forms of sales automation, and what their attitudes are about it, and will it become the norm? Is it pie in the sky, something in between? And we conducted it late last year. The dates are here. It was over a couple of weeks last fall. We got 95 completes, which is a pretty decent sample to sort of those companies that are actually directly selling to small business. And sort of what we wanted to do on top of this gave us some numbers to work with, to get a sense of who's BIYing and who's doing this and that. But we also wanted to get some perspectives. So we actually layered on top of that very informal survey that we sent out to people we know in the industry who are at doing product-led sales, or who have been in the trenches over the years of trying to sell software to small businesses, have tried everything and failed at a lot of it and learned the hard lessons from that. And we wanted to hear what they had to say. So we pushed that out, got a bunch of comments, some across a pretty wide spectrum of viewpoints, and then many of those comments are shared in the report. And then we followed up with some direct interviews to flesh it out even further with some of the respondents as well. So it's really a combination of some survey data with some just deeper conversations about what's going on. That's the background on the survey. And one of the things we asked the survey sample, the 95 respondents, just how do you sell? Because we wanted to know, are these people who already or maybe they're product-led companies and they've never had salespeople, or maybe they're pure, feet on the street salespeople. We kind of know what we were working with, and it was largely companies that currently sell directly or through channel partners or through a combination. Relatively small percentage of them are already self-purchase, sort of product-led companies. So it gives you a sense that we're getting the perspectives of those who, if there is a BIY transition, they would be undergoing a transition themselves. So that perspective is important to have. And so just kind of summarizing what we learned from this, and we'll get into each of these in some detail over the rest of the webinar. Clearly the BIY future that we described in the headline and the title of the report and everything, it's already here, and it's here to stay, and it's only going to become a bigger factor. Nuance in terms of where it's here and where it isn't here and where it will go in the future, but it's here now. And I think we all know this because we all interact with products that never involve sales. But the question is that going to evolve into areas where sales is the norm today? We'll get into that. Number two, there is this generational component, which stands to reason, but it's very, very clear in the data, and it has a lot of implications on where this goes in the future. As I sort of alluded to earlier, we're not arguing for the end of sales, through a robot-led future or anything like that. We are arguing that sales will change and is changing and has changed and will change further, and a lot of that has to do with BIY and automation. But there will always be an important role for salespeople. It's just going to be a different role, we believe, in the future. We also want to highlight that there is a lot of friction and challenges to adoption of BIY. We'll get into that in some detail. And then we'll kind of wrap it up with, why, if you're an SMB seller, which presumably most in the audience for this webinar are either selling directly to SMBs or building products for SMBs, where do you fit into this? And so we'll have some conversation about that to wrap it up. And we're going to go to the first learning, and I think Matt, you're going to walk us through this one.
Yeah. So unsurprisingly here, obviously with the title of the report and the webinar, the BIY future is here. So I would say this was pretty overwhelming, but also affirming, is that the vast majority of respondents in the survey believe that SMBs were, either already self-purchasing or would soon be self-purchasing software and services. Of course, I think that's not surprising to me. I think, just as I mentioned before, just like consumers and enterprise buyers, we see this happening, with if you follow anything from open ventures with Slack and all these unicorns where they've been product-led growth, why would SMBs be different? And there was, my personal belief is, and I think maybe I tilt a little bit on the generational aspects that we'll talk to, but my personal belief is that, not all products, if not all products, most products should and could be self-purchased. But I do think it is important to note that in the survey, there was some caution, and a lot of folks responded that they felt more positive about commoditized products or established products, such as websites, for example, were especially ripe to deem less than assistance from sales as DIY continues to be the norm. So we see this trend happening, but we also think that maybe it will be something that sort of happens over time, especially as you're further down through that product continuum, and DIY becomes more of a reality. So that's the first learning.
Yeah. So the next one, as mentioned already, is this generational component. So we're going to show you in the next slide here what the numbers really are. And this is again the sample of those who are selling to small businesses, and a pretty commanding 85% of them said younger businesses will be more willing to DIY, and that will impact future adoption. Again, we would have had a going in assumption about this, but that number is pretty overwhelming. And and I think even among the skeptics we talked to, or sort of neutral on the future of or the present situation with DIY, generally acknowledge that the future will that younger decision makers will do it today, and that will sort of guide adoption in the future. So it's clear in the data. And then sort of the next slide, we did this report a while back, not that long ago, but where and Matt had mentioned this before, where we talked about, what is the new small business SaaS customer like? What are their decision-making processes like? What are their attitudes? And we got into a little bit about their attitudes about, DIY versus, do it for me, and their attitude towards working with salespeople. And it was pretty clear in the data that this move toward automation, do it yourself, buy it yourself, it was kind of signaled in this report as well. So it's very consistent here, where 82% of business owners, 1834, have DIY'd. And then when you look at sort of, the views on younger decision makers' willingness to DIY, it's very consistent. This points to, and we're not citing it here, but in other presentations I've done in the past, I've cited some Pew Research data, I believe it was, that, and I think it was using census data to make this call, like 10,000-ish American citizens or American residents turn 65 every day or something like that. I don't hold me to the specifics, but it's an overwhelming turnover there. And that signals that, there's a big turnover in small business ownership from older generation to younger generation. So it's all sort of pointing in the direction of more automation, more interest in buying, sort of doing your own research, buying it yourself, and then sort of the relationship sort of begins later after the sale.
Yeah, and anecdotally, I can tell you that I have a number of friends who have recently acquired small businesses from retiring owners.
Right.
But anyway, the next learning we want to talk about is, as we've spoken to already, is that there's definitely not an argument here that sales is dead. And of course, this is a salesperson telling you this, so take it with a grain of salt. But the survey data kind of confirmed this as well, where we asked about, are you automating any part of the sales? And unsurprisingly, most of the respondents, although it's fairly split, said that they currently were, or they were looking to in the future automate some of the process. But if you actually look at the sort of the sales process going from lead qualification down to closing, you'll see that those numbers sort of shrink along the process, and I think that does tell a little bit of a story. But my opinion is actually that sales enablement and sales automation, rather than killing sales, is going to actually make salespeople more efficient. And I think this is sort of interdependent from, you should have a self-serve option and a touchless sales option, but also knowing that it's definitely easy to make the sales reps more efficient and also increase their conversion rates by helping them through automation. So, if we look at sort of where sales has gone, you went from sales qualified leads, which is cold calling, hot knocking, really just throwing anything at the wall, moving into marketing qualified leads, which was essentially created by inbound marketing in general was a segment created by HubSpot, and that became ubiquitous. And we have some case studies that show some conversion rates on marketing qualified leads, but that next step and that next evolution is this product qualified leads, and this is where your product is giving some value. You can self-purchase it, but SMBs are still going to need a little bit of help. If we go back to this previous slide, you can see that number gets lowest at closing the sale, and maybe that's not in the sort of traditional sense of like the hard close, but certainly I think there's a human element to closing, and then there is that sort of point where you need to get the user over that activation point and upsell them. So I think that that sales is going to be changing to be a little bit more consultative, more about educating, and definitely kind of providing that expertise and that help. I think the ideal sell is something where you don't even really feel like you're being sold, but being helped.
Right.
So moving on to the fourth one here, Charles.
Yeah. So what we're talking about, kind of alluded to earlier, that this is not a frictionless path. That there's some we sort of identified some challenges to BIY adoption in the survey that kind of share a little bit of that with you here. And I'll kind of talk mostly about the first two, and really mostly about the first one, because I think it's probably the most profound, and that's convincing leadership that BIY is viable. And it's sort of one of these situations where you kind of have to get past the sort of a crossing of the Rubicon. You have to get past this sort of the fear factor involved in making a major change. We read a lot about how this notion. There's this book out, I forgot the name of it, about subscriptions and how everything's becoming a subscription-based model, and the idea that when you transition, you have to sort of live through a dip in your revenue before it starts to rise again. And I think there's a fear among many who see some of the potential advantages of BIY, also fearing what happens when you make that transition. So when we had some comments along those lines from the report, had a long conversation with Chris Black from UpTop. He's a big advocate of this direction for the industry, but he acknowledged that there's friction all along the way when you're trying to make a big change like this. You have to deal with sales resistance, and often leadership is very reluctant to sort of do battle with the sales organization unless there's some sort of major trigger for that. And then the other sort of comment that's not right here, but this notion that no one wants to be the CEO that made the switch from a sales-led to a sort of a automated selling model and then have it fail, and then your revenue craters. So that's a big step to overcome, and I think that needed to be acknowledged. When you sort of talk about the challenges, and I think that the notion going back where I think the second one was about SMB adoption. There's still some skepticism that small businesses will be willing to go through a full automated process, because there's often conversations about small businesses being terribly busy and impatient with technology and unwilling to sort of gut it out in a challenging process. And I think that led to some commentary around, well, the process has to have kind of an off-ramp to a human interaction, for example, as a way to sort of make the transition and get people across the line to do this, because the generational component we mentioned, there'll be younger business owners that are sort of used to this from everything they do in their life, and they'll go through the process, whereas maybe someone at a different stage of their business life might not have the patience or willingness to do this. So if the systems aren't agile enough and good enough to guide anyone through it, they're going to have some problems. And I think that was just something that was surfaced in the report and we wanted to acknowledge.
Yeah, and I think came up time and time again. So anyway, kind of wrapping up these learnings and themes, and then you will get into sort of how you can think about implementing this, and then also some case studies. The last one here, why does BIY make sense for digital service providers specifically? And as we discussed, the service survey respondents agreed, at least on the anticipated benefits of DIY, that it really comes down to a few things. And bottom line, number one is definitely reducing the cost of acquisition. And I think this is really important, especially when we're talking about micro SMBs and kind of the smaller SMBs, where it's just not really sustainable to have a sales force, especially at very low conversion rates, calling on this. That's expensive. So that's one opportunity. Definitely better alignment with the SMB's needs. I think that sort of comes down to customer expectations and customer service, and having product-led growth, allowing someone to sort of go through some of these path of purchases on their own and then even convert on their own is really what the SMBs are looking for. Ideally that's going to lead to less churn, right? Because you sort of you've removed sales forcing someone into a product, and rather you have the SMB sort of self-adopting and raising their hand that this is something they want. We had, I think, one comment in this report that did sort of question whether this might, if it's easy to buy, it could be easy to churn out too, and that probably is something to think about. But ultimately, we also saw comments in the report as well that surmise that the funnel would be so much bigger that that churn should be really less of a concern. And the last opportunity that we kind of pulled from the report is that this thought that DIY may lead to more engagement, of course, and ultimately then there's this really nice path to upsell, because with more engagement you can have more buying signals, ideally kind of move that SMB up the funnel and ultimately have a little bit of a higher average sales value. And that's kind of where definitely putting on my mono hat, that's really where we see the value here is make it easy to buy, but maybe shift some of that sales cost into customer service costs, so you can have that upsell path, so that where maybe the SMB comes in and self purchases, you mentioned it, Charles, they're time strapped, they still need help, and so having that lending hand and then being able to layer on that service model on top of that to me is where a lot of the digital service providers in the industry can really differentiate themselves. And before we sort of get into just how do we leverage Buy It Yourself, I just kind of wanted to give a personal example, talking about self-service and self-purchase with a company called Gusto. So for those on the call that aren't familiar with Gusto, it's essentially a self-serve payroll platform that's certainly done very well. I think they've got about 900 employees now here in Denver, and they are certainly a unicorn in terms of valuation. But we were looking at Mono, we were switching payroll companies, and we did the research. I went out, I activated with Gusto, and what's interesting there is you can activate for free. You don't actually get charged until you process that first payroll. So of course, but between sort of deciding that we want to use Gusto and then ultimately having payroll, there's pretty heavy lifting. It's a lot of administrative tasks to pull off of the previous payroll and on the Gusto. And what was pretty unique is, not only was I getting hit with targeted drip campaigns and emails and things like that, but I was getting phone calls every time I logged into the platform. hey, I noticed you did this. Did you need help doing this? Are you getting stuck here? Those sort of things. So, it was definitely helping us getting over that activation hump so that they could monetize mono. But also what kind of happened during the course of that as well was that, these customer service reps, or they might have even been salespeople for that matter, and it's good that I couldn't tell the difference. They're also recommending other services. So by the time we actually activated, not only did we have payroll, but we had 401k, we had workers' comp, I knew about their concierge service, all these things where they took us from poking around the interface to a paying customer to a valuable customer pretty quickly. And quite frankly, when it happens that organically, it felt really good. And obviously it made my job easier.
You didn't feel like you were sold at any point, right?
Right, exactly. And I think you could probably find a number of examples in that where it's sort of an organic sell, and that's how it should be. Yeah. So 3 ways to leverage BIY. First and foremost, because this can be it's probably feels like boiling the ocean if you're sitting in an executive room, but first and foremost, and probably the least friction, we think just adding a touchless sale option on your website for your existing do-it-for-me solutions is one way to get started. So, essentially just having e-commerce. Many of we have a lot of partners that are doing this, which is exciting, but I can tell you that, and we're no different, many of our partners don't even have their pricing listed on their site, and there's no transparency there, and you have to talk to sales, just to get pricing, let alone to purchase. So I think that's number one thing that you can do. Just take that friction out of the sales process. Number two, of course, there's a distinction between DIY and fulfillment on the DIY side. We definitely think there's an opportunity, and this is kind of looking through specifically the lens of websites, but I think it can applied elsewhere, of course, is broadening your funnel with a self-purchase and self-service DIY offering. In the report that we mentioned at the top of the call, the new SMB buyer, we had 36% of SMBs that told us they DIY'd their website. And playing on that generational component, I think it was actually 46% of millennials when we went into the firmographics said that they DIY'd. So if your current sales model right now is traditional sales qualified leads and do it for me services, obviously you're missing out on a big portion of the market and missing out on a lot of opportunities. The third one that we have here, and this is probably a little bit more transformational, but it is implementing a product-led growth strategy. And so that's product-led growth is really letting your product sell itself. It's free trials. It's maybe that freemium model, and then looking for some of these buying signals and intent signals so that you can either have a touchless sale driven entirely by your product, or have that sales assist model where the product is really doing the selling, and then you can kind of come in and have that human element to, as in the Gusto example, to sort of get the SMB over the hurdle and bring them up the value chain. So that being said, we do have two case studies, and then we'll get to any questions that anyone has. So feel free to pop those into the chat. The first case study that we have, this is from a partner that we have at Mono here in the US, and they have a product-led growth model that they've implemented to sell SMBs, where essentially they have marketing qualified leads coming in from organically through SEO into sort of a marketing grader. And then they have product generated leads that are coming in from buying signals within their app. They don't do any cold outbound sales. So they've kind of lowered that cost of acquisition, but they do have sales reps that then call on these marketing and product qualified leads. And you'll see that their overall conversion rates are over 8% on the product led initiatives, and over 2.5% on the marketing qualified leads, which is, in perspective, cold calling and inside sales is, hovering around 1, maximum 2%. So, they've taken out that cost, but they've also increased their a couple of quotes from an executive at that partner, sort of summarizing some of the themes that we've had here, but I thought they were really relevant. We've never done cold calling. This is higher overhead and time consuming. We use the help you recommendation approach. The buying process needs a mirror consumer process because they act so similarly. The other quote here, as you can see, we have higher success with product qualified leads. They're great opportunities for our reps to engage the SMB. And we know that once they commit to the demo, and I think that's really important, right? Because you have a buying signal, then you get them on the phone, and now you get them to commit to the sales process. And in that sense, they actually have an 82% success rate converting those free users into paid users. And so this is a digital services company that's kind of gone all in on product-led growth. The next case study we have is from our friends at Vendasta. They've had sort of a traditional go-to-market strategy within the space of the digital marketing solutions, and they've been doing some really cool things over the last year and a half or so around product-led growth. And they shared some of these numbers with us with one of their agency partners. So essentially, they're enabling their agencies to have a white label app that they can give for free for 90 days to their SMB customers that sort of has a dashboard, gives them some value about some metrics around their business, tips and suggestions and the like, and then they go for the upsell. And so this was an agency in South Carolina. They targeted, it's a smaller sample, but I think it's really powerful. They targeted 31 SMB customers. Of those 31, 26 of them logged in. So they logged in and then started hitting those buying signals within the app. And then of those 29, 19 converted into at least one paid offering. So, for this agency in South Carolina, those numbers can be definitely transformational. And obviously going back to CAC, that the cost of acquisition's gone down completely when you're calling on 26 engaged users and converting a majority of them. So, just kind of summarize there, those are two real world examples. I think, this is something that everybody should be thinking about. I think it's something that can be certainly implemented, relatively easy, at least in baby steps. And I think it's something that we're going to see increasing within the industry. And I think it's exciting for the industry. So, with that, hopefully we've got some questions and then we can wrap things up.
Thanks, Matt. So there are a couple questions. Why don't we just get into them? And the first one is, are there products, and I'm assuming this has been within the context of the products we generally talk about in this locology space, but are there products that will never be DIY in your opinion? Like, are there things that just will always need to be sold? What's your thought?
My thought, yeah, well, I think my opinion is probably not to the vast majority, but if you want to take an extreme example, you can look at Tesla. Right. So, Tesla got rid of the dealership model, right? And they got rid of car salespeople, and they've completely upended the car buying process. And even if you go into a Tesla store, I don't know if you ever have,
nope.
There's people there to answer questions. I only have because I'm dreaming of a Tesla, not because I can afford it. But
you gotta have a vision, man.
That's right. They have people there. You can touch and feel things. You can do a test drive. They have people answering your questions. But if you want to actually buy a car, you have to go and order it online, and you have to self-procure that car. So that's right. Probably an extreme example of a vehicle. But to the original question of, are there products that will never be DIY? Well, yeah, probably. There probably are. I could see, things that are complicated, products maybe that are new movers into a space and that are creating new categories. Probably products that are, higher value and higher dollar value. There's probably certainly arguments across the board, but I do think even for those products, there will I think we will increasingly see, some of these strategies around product-led growth, product qualified leads, buying intent, buying signals, all these things assisting that sales process, even if it is not touchless.
Because BIY is not a binary thing; it's really more of a continuum. And the only thing I would add to that is that there was a lot of commentary in the paper about, commoditized products will BIY, but non-commoditized products require sales. But the other point of that is that what is a commoditized product today was once a product that required sales, because it was, and one definition sort of used in the report is that if it's before the value of the product as a category, not as a specific branded product, before the value of it is widely accepted and understood, it requires a salesperson to explain and persuade. Once it's sort of widely understood, then that's sort of when the sort of self-education and self-purchase becomes sort of more natural. That was one perspective shared in the report. I think it's pretty fair.
Yeah, I think it's relevant.
So that doesn't say, so that's sort of the argument is, it may not be DIY today, but as the product evolves, it may evolve into a product that will be DIY. So that's one way to answer the question. And I would also add that I think really, really big enterprise level deals will probably always require salespeople, but that same product may have tiers. You have an enterprise tier and then you have an SMB tier. The SMB tier may be self-purchased, fairly soon, but those big $1 million deals will probably always require a pretty highly compensated salesperson to close, just because it's so much money involved. But even then, yeah.
Well, I think another interesting point on that, one of the articles that you and I were passing back and forth before this, and that I think you were even referenced on one of your blog posts, was talking about some of these the idyllic sort of product like growth companies like Atlassian and Slack, who started out with no sales teams, and they did do, like I heard on this one podcast, Atlassian had this $4 million deal basically come through that they never even looked at. No engineer talked to them. Nobody talked to
a touchless $4 million. Yeah.
Yeah, but obviously that's not the norm. And so the article that we're looking at, it was showing how over time these product like growth companies who started with 0 salespeople were adding salespeople at a pretty ferocious clip. So it's definitely something, to your point, that's probably not static.
No, and just to add a little color to that article we're referring to, and you can go to the Locology Insider blog and find it. But basically, the most of those salespeople were being applied the way we've been talking about on this webinar. I was about to say podcast. It seemed, But anyway, where it's mostly, it's still the product-led customer acquisition where no one talks to anybody and it's all, but then as they signal, a big more need, and then that's when the sales come in and, for larger accounts and that sort of thing, and to move people up the value chain. But none of them have moved to, having salespeople acquire customers initially, as far as I could tell.
Yeah.
So we got one more. Should we be recruiting a different sales profile? Again, I guess that's within the context of sales moving more to post customer acquisition service support. Should we be recruiting a different sales profile, fewer hard charging closers, more empathetic listeners? What do you think, man?
Yes, I think.
I think it's a fairly easy.
I think that's probably self-evident after been speaking for the last hour, but definitely. And I think another quote that came from the conversation from the case studies, that's exactly what our partner is doing. Is of course they don't have outbound sales, but they do have sales reps calling on these marketing qualified leads and product qualified leads, and they look for a profile that is sort of a sales bent customer success person. And I'm guessing that is the exact profile that I spoke to at Gusto time and time again when I was getting these calls. So that's probably a definite for me.
Okay. All right. I think we will end it there. So Lizzie, we're going to hand it back to you. Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you, Charles and Matt, so much. Lots of great questions and discussion. Thanks again to Mono Solutions for putting this together with Charles. It was really great hearing everything. Just a few more items from Locology before we end today's webinar. You'll be able to view today's broadcast along with previous webinars on our website, locology.com. Just navigate to Research and Resources and drop down to Webinars. We have an event coming up. Join us for our main annual conference, Locology 2020, formerly known as LSA 20. It's going to be in San Antonio, March 16th through 18th. Our annual conference brings together leaders and locals from across the United States and internationally for discussion, education, and networking. We'll define what winning in local looks like in 2020 and share our vision for how the local market will change radically by 2025. Registration is open and you can find more information on our website. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please be sure to visit locology.com and subscribe for updates to be the first to know about future webinars. I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.